Welcome to the AZ Political Podcast. I'm Jim Sharpe, and our headlines this week, headline number one, former presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and soon-to-be former President Joe Biden are campaigning in Arizona over the next few days. But since we're used to getting actual candidates here, I'm kind of wondering, are we becoming a less important state in this presidential race? Headline number two, in separate interviews on KTAR, Republican Senate candidate Kari Lake insisted that there must be something awful in the paperwork from her opponent, Ruben Gallego's divorce from Kate Gallego, the mayor of Phoenix. But Gallego says he wants those documents to remain sealed to protect the privacy of his and Mayor Gallego's son. And headline number three, anticipating legal challenges to next month's results, the Arizona Supreme Court is ordering judges in lower courts to expedite cases involving the 2024 election. That's because the state's high court is trying to make sure that disputes over the results of the November 5th election are resolved within the statutory deadlines. Now, if we could just get candidates to concede the election in a reasonable time frame, some kind of deadline, like, by the time the next election rolls around. That brings me to my guest on the AZ Political Podcast, a guy by the name of Jim Cross, a guy I've known for a long time. And hang on, I got proof I've known this guy a long time. Here's a picture I took in the KTAR studio in 2002. And while I've known him a long time, I'm not going to have a whole lot of time left to work with him because Jim Cross announced at a recent staff meeting that he will be retired officially December 6th.
Yes.
That's another day that'll live in infamy in December.
Yeah.
So I thought it was important to have you in on the political podcast to talk about, all the years you've been covering politics in Arizona, and the things you've seen along the ways, the changes. So let's start with this, Jim. Well, first off, how about all the groans and the how dare yous that you got when you announced your retirement? Did you?
Oh, there were a few.
Did you feel good about that?
Yeah. No. I mean,
This was not like a contract negotiation ploy, right?
No, it was
actually.
No, I mean, it was just time. It was, 25 years, most of it very, very fun. So.
And Jim, I really appreciate this, actually is wearing a real cowboy hat. I asked him to do so because he's like our cowboy reporter here. He goes out and he lassos up some news.
Yeah.
So in your 25 plus years covering Arizona politics, did you ever anticipate either Arizona becoming a swing state or how much election integrity would become topic number one for the party that had a former stranglehold on Arizona politics, the Republicans?
No, and no. I mean, Arizona, as you know, has always been a political player.
Yeah.
Probably not at the level it is right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's very possible that we could determine the presidential race, and or the U.S. Senate battle and the balance of power in the Senate. It could come down to Arizona, both of those. One or both. That shows you what a player we are. And Arizona, and you know this from years and years, Arizona's got a connection to everything. So
I know.
One of the first things, if a story is happening anywhere in the world, is like, okay, where's the Arizona tie at? And now we're right in the thick of it.
Yeah.
So it's going to be very interesting next, 3 weeks.
Couple weeks, yeah. Something like that. Yeah. It really is crazy how we went from being a solidly red state to a pretty purple state.
Yeah.
And I think really we saw that change over in 2020 when, all the people at the top of Arizona state government were elected who were Democrats, but also when we ended up with 2 Democratic U.S. senators representing Arizona for the first time since the Truman administration.
Yeah.
I know you haven't been around since that time.
Not quite.
Not suggesting.
Close.
Is that kind of when you saw this change coming, or was it before that?
Well, you had President Biden won the state in 2020, narrowly.
Yeah.
I believe it was 14,000 votes, if memory serves.
A little over 10, yeah.
You mentioned we have 2 United States senators, Democrat, independent now, Kirsten Sinema.
Right.
But at the time, we had twin Democrats in there. There's been a shift And I don't know exactly what caused it. It could have been the population flow may have had something to do with it. It could have been, the nature of politics and people like one candidate or another. But we have a very interesting next election ahead of us. You've got a very close presidential race in almost every poll, in every battleground state, and we're proud to say we're one of the 7 big battleground states. You have a reasonably close Senate race between Gallego. He's holding on to, 5, 6, 7 point lead over the Republican Kerry Lake.
Yeah.
So that one's close, and you know how polls are. I mean, a lot of them can be really accurate, and then a lot of them, election day, it's like, yeah, okay, it didn't quite fall right. So,
right. Well, I know. I was just looking at the latest. So, New York Times has a giant list of polls, and they average them out, and it's about a 2-point lead for Trump in Arizona right now at this very moment on this day that we're recording this podcast. But the New York Times own poll has Trump up by 6. So, you don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, you have polls that are wildly all over the place. It's either, and this is Arizona and nationally, either Harris close or Trump close. But in some polls, Trump has a more secure lead. And the same could be said for Harris. 4 or 5 point lead. Same for former President Trump. So it's really hard to put a firm. This is we've had elections in the past. You go, okay, this is a shoe, and this candidate's going to win. There's not a chance they're going to lose. This one,
yeah.
I mean, it could go either way.
Yeah, it's like why they say in football, you actually got to play the game.
You play the game
to find out who wins, and I guess that's what we're going to do on November 5th. So before the last 2 presidential elections and the last gubernatorial election, which also saw a Secretary of State and an Attorney General elected to those high offices in Arizona, what was the craziest political time in Arizona that you remember?
Probably 2000.
Yeah, that was nutty.
Because I remember we were downtown at the Republican headquarters downtown, at one of the hotels. And they said, okay, come on back. And I think at the time, Gore had won, if memory serves.
Right, because it went back and forth
was one of them.
Times, right?
And I was on the way back to the station about 11:30 in a minute, and I said, turn around and go back downtown. So I went back downtown, and we still didn't know for days afterward because of what we learned, hanging chads, who knew, in Florida.
Yeah.
So they had to go back and redo all that stuff. And, eventually, George W. Bush won a very narrow election. That was crazy because it went for weeks after we didn't know. And, there were multiple court challenges. And that was back in 2000. And then we get the 2020 election, and you again get multiple court challenges, probably far exceeding what happened in 2000 because of, there were a lot of people that were concerned that, election integrity. There were many people who believed and still believe that election was rigged, even though every challenge has been thrown out of court.
So that's not really... Hang on. What did that just... I don't know. Do you have hay on your hat? Is that what's causing this?
Yeah. As good as anything else.
I can't remember the last time I sneezed on the radio, much less on camera. This is
I've done it before we go to live shots. Once in a while you're holding, you're going, don't sneeze, don't sneeze. But
yeah. So I was just going to say, that's not, so this last few years is not the first time we've heard rigged election and we've heard election challenges. No. I mean, really, 2000, that was so close, and the Supreme Court had to step in and essentially decide the winner by shutting down the recount in Florida and all that. I mean, this is not necessarily something completely new.
No, and the one thing I remember about the 2000 election, say, versus 2020, was even though you had a very divided electorate, I don't remember the venom back in 2000 being at the level it is in 20 or, what's almost sure to be coming out of this upcoming election.
Yeah.
The vitriol between the two sides, there's really no gray area anymore. It's either, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you're a Trump supporter, you're a Harris supporter. I mean, you have independents who will very likely swing this election one way or the other. But there are very few undecided voters left right now. I mean, it's 1 or 2% probably.
I think you're right.
Two very polarizing candidates.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a lot of nose holding going on. It's like, oh, I can't stand either one of these people, but I have to decide for this person, and they're not. Even those folks aren't waiting. They've kind of already pretty much made up their mind. Yeah. They're just, they're voting for the lesser of two evils in their mind, but they've kind of made their mind up on which evil they're going for. This is interesting because I don't know if a lot of people know this, but before Jim came to KTAR, he was working in Kingman.
Yep.
And that was a big time of a divide in our country, too, because, you did some really great journalistic work on the Oklahoma City bombings, which had a Kingman angle to that story.
It did. And to this day, I believed it then, I believe it now, Kingman took an unfair beating on that because the Oklahoma City bomber, Timothy McVeigh, was not from Kingman. He was there basically staying with a friend of his, Michael Fortier, and the FBI, I had been in Kingman about 3 days before the Oklahoma City bombing, and the boss called me. I was back at the motel, and he said, you got to come back to work. The FBI's in town looking for John Doe number 2.
Because you were staying in a motel before you found a house.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
And so I went back to the station, and that night we ended up at the sheriff's office, and the FBI came into town en masse. You had investigators all over the place, and this was like this for weeks as they chased down, what they thought was John Doe 2. I mean, we were camped outside of the armory all night long because the rumor was that John Doe 2 was inside being interrogated, and that turned out not to be the case. That was a very volatile time. People were in shock, and 9/11 was obviously hugely shocking.
Yeah.
But for 1995, that Oklahoma City, especially because it was carried out by an American citizen, it was domestic terror.
Yeah.
And that had a huge impact on the country and the world. But it was that was a tough time for this country and for the state.
Yeah. And definitely a sign of, people feeling very differently about their government.
Yes, especially in McVeigh's case.
Yeah, and the difference between the two parties in some ways too. Not that I ever heard a Republican say, "Oh, that was okay what happened in Oklahoma City," no. But and then I'm going to fast forward a few years to 2009, 2010, when John McCain was censured by the county Republican Party, and there seemed to be a big divide coming into the Republican Party. You had the McCain moderates, if you will, and I always thought John McCain was a pretty solid fiscal conservative. And then you had those who were like, you know what? If you're not completely 100% on board with the Republican platform, you're not really a Republican. And I believe it was right around that time the term rhino, Republican in name only, was invented. That was a really weird time in Arizona politics, too.
Yeah, it really was. And people, forget that McCain was really within an eyelash of becoming the president.
Right.
He was ahead by, if I remember right, 7, 8, 9 points in the polls before the economy crashed in 2008. And soon-to-be President Obama overtook him in the polls and won the election. But McCain, he ran a fairly successful campaign. He was very close to becoming a president. But you're right. I mean, it seemed about that time that you had the beginning of a fracture in the party, because you have so-called McCain conservatives, Republicans. You have Trump Republicans. Mm-hmm. You have the Democratic Party, obviously. You've got the independents. To some point, the Democratic Party is fractured. You have the progressive side. You have the Democratic side. So the old uniparties or whatever, that's not the case. There's a lot of voices in the mix now.
Yeah, it's almost like if you could go back, if you could, rewind to 2008, it would almost seem to me like Sarah Palin would have represented one part of the party and John McCain would have represented another part of the party, and they wouldn't have belonged on the same ticket at all together, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And,
but I guess, sometimes that's how you unify a ticket, right? But
yeah, I mean, I think obviously looking back, what McCain was trying to do was he brought a female onto the ticket with him, and he thought that, maybe that would benefit him in the presidential race. And again, he was he was very, very close until the last few weeks of winning that thing.
Yeah.
But she was a very polarizing figure at the time. And honestly, you look back at this, she wasn't that polarizing compared to some of the people that are going now.
Oh,
we are a very polarized society right now.
Not even close. And to your point you made earlier about, how Arizona always seems to find itself in the middle of everything, from around the world and around the country. 1964, you obviously weren't working in media at that point, but, Barry Goldwater ran for president. We could have had two presidents from Arizona at one point or another.
Yeah.
So
it is morphed tremendously from what it's been over the last few decades.
So are you going to miss it?
Parts of it, yeah.
Or are you just going to sit back and go, oh, thank gosh, I don't have to talk about that anymore?
That could be a component of it. Yeah, I mean, there are parts of it. I'll miss it. I've been doing this a long, long time. And I'll miss the people. I'll miss, when I see a big story, I'm going to be going, I could have done this and I could have done that. And then the better side will go, you could have.
You could have. But you get to sit at home and, crack a beer and kind of giggle and point at the whole thing. That's nice. So any chance I can talk you out of retiring? I had to ask.
I'm gonna think about that. And I'm gonna get back to you.
Okay.
I'll have my people talk to your people.
That way it won't be December 6th. That also is a day that will live in infamy when Jim Cross, my guest this week on the AZ Political Podcast, officially retires. So is that your last day, or is that your first day retired, December 6th?
Officially December 7th.
Okay.
Because the pay period runs to December 7th.
So it really is a day to live in infamy.
And it's my birthday, too.
Oh, there you go.
I figure it was easy to remember.
So,
but the last work day will be December 6th, yeah.
So for your birthday present, you're stiffing all the rest of us. That's just awesome. Thanks a lot, buddy.
There you go.
All right. Hey, thanks, Jim, though.
Sure.
And, man, it's been a pleasure.
It has.
All these years I've known you.
Even
when we didn't work at the same station, we'd see each other out on the streets and whatnot. Yeah. And
well, radio, it's like a lot of other professions. Once you're in it, you're in it for life, whether you're
that's true
still in the building or not.
True.
So.
Yeah, no, a Hall of Famer here too, by the way. So if your 401k tanks, just you're welcome back.
I'll
throw it out.
I'll hit you up for that.
All right. Thanks for joining us on this week's AZ Political Podcast. I'm Jim Sharpe. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for watching the AZ Political Podcast with Jim Sharpe. Click the box to watch more from KTAR News and tap the button in the middle to subscribe.